All right, a very obvious place to begin when talking about mythology is at the beginning. So, one of our first major topics will be creation myths, creation stories, and we'll be doing a little bit of comparative mythology, although we're mostly going to be dealing with kind of the Greeks on the Greeks' own terms. But when you talk about kind of the beginning of recorded mythology. Like we talked about in the last presentation, one of the things that defines myth is that you can't pinpoint its origin. Well, in terms of kind of surviving narrative, you have to start somewhere. And when you talk about the earliest poets, and indeed the earliest literature that the Greeks produced was poetry. You're really talking about two figures. You're talking about Homer, who's perhaps the best known for his poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and we'll be reading the Odyssey together. But you're also talking about Hesiod, and Hesiod was, well, we don't like along as with Homer, we don't know a lot about him. The best that we can describe him is as semi-legendary. Probably most scholars, I would say, probably believe there actually was a Hesiod, in the way that most scholars would believe that there actually was a Homer. Although there is disagreement about this, we'll talk more about that later. But he belongs to an era. Most historians would place Hesiod, whoever he was, about the middle of the 8th century BC. So around 750, just kind of split the difference here. And that's an era where Greece itself is emerging from a long, kind of centuries long period of darkness. It's sometimes actually called the Greek Dark Ages, where there's nothing is being produced in terms of material culture. Certainly not literature. We're not seeing lots of organization of cities, of societies, but it's in that 8th century that this starts to change, and it's a bit of kind of a romantic kind of hook to hang things on. But many historians will point to kind of the poetry of Hesiod and Homer as being the flashpoint of kind of the beginnings of what we really, when we talk about kind of ancient Greek culture, it really begins with the poetry of these two men. And Hesiod left behind two poems that we can translate and read today, and both of them have to do with kind of the origins of the world and the origins of humanity, and an attempt to explain why the world is as it is. His Theogony, which is just a Greek term which means the birth of the gods, and his Works and Days, which presents itself as a kind of handbook for farmers, believe it or not. But also within it contains lots of these famous legends, probably the most famous of them being the Pandora story. And if you put these two poems together, you get a kind of theology of origins for the ancient Greeks. Now it's I think you have to be careful in when you read a story like this, and come to the conclusion that, well, this is what all the Greeks believed. I think this is certainly probably a good template for kind of understanding the way that the Greeks thought about their own origins. But there's so much that we simply don't know about the ancient Greeks and their beliefs and their belief systems. So we always have to be a little bit careful in kind of taking stories like these and then making these leaps of interpretation. Now, lots of creation stories survive from different cultures from around the world. We have lots of kind of ancient Babylonian and ancient Egyptian, ancient Roman creation stories. We have Jewish creation stories. We have ancient Indic creation stories. We have lots of comparative material. And what scholars of mythology have noticed when you put a lot of these stories side by side is that they share a lot of kind of general themes. What you often find is that creation stories begin with a kind of nothingness or disorderedness or chaos, as I have it here. Actually, chaos is a Greek word. Chaos is a kind of deity of some sort in Hesiod's Theogony. And then out of that chaos, out of that disorder, develops order. So order out of chaos is a term you'll often hear in the study of creation stories. You also often find in these kinds of stories, you find that the first deities are synonymous with nature. And so the sky is a god, the earth is a goddess, and so on and so forth. And so there's no difference between nature and deities very often in these kinds of stories. But as the generations of deities go down the line, the gods become much more this mouthful of a word here, anthropomorphic, which just means human shaped. They become more humanoid. And so I'm sure some of you have had some experience with Greek mythology, whether you've studied it elsewhere, or you've read Percy Jackson, or you've seen various films, to know that you've heard of gods and goddesses like Zeus and Hera and Athena and Apollo. And again, no big deal if you haven't. This course doesn't assume any knowledge on your part. But Zeus is very much, when he's depicted, he's very much a human-looking god, heavily bearded, middle-aged man. He's a sky god, but he's not the sky. And so as we go down these generations of deities, we're kind of pointing towards that anthropomorphic, human-shaped deities of that Olympian generation of Zeus and his brothers and sisters and their children. And then you often find in these creation stories kind of these three main stages: the theogony, the birth of the gods. I'm using Greek terms here. Cosmogony, which means the birth of the universe. And as we will see, when your gods are parts of nature, when gods are born, the universe is born. So sometimes these two are part and parcel of each other. And then theomachy, which means a battle between the gods, the war of the gods. And so the idea is that you get these generations of various deities. And of course, this only works if you have a polytheistic system. Many gods and goddesses, all with their own interests and jealousies and agendas. And so they end up bumping into each other and warring against each other. And when that dust settles from that theomachy, then you're finally left with who's in charge, what generation of deities wins that war. And then we can start to delegate some of the other aspects of kind of solidifying power in this divine universe. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes within that, there's kind of a notion of, okay, succession, okay, which gods are, what's the hierarchy, what's the org chart, who's in charge of what. And then where do human beings fit into all of this? Very often in these kinds of stories, human beings are an afterthought, but they do form a part of many of these origin creation stories. So in Hesiod's Theogony, we see pretty much all of these things: birth of the gods, birth of the universe, warring of the gods, and then some sort of succession story at the end to kind of organize this universe. And one of the questions you might say that Hesiod is setting out to answer, although it's the text itself, you'll see it in the Powell text, it's pretty skeletal. I mean, Hesiod doesn't kind of self-interpret. He basically just kind of tells you the story. But one of the questions I think that he is trying to answer and explain to his audience is, how do we get from these earliest kind of primeval deities, some of the first gods or goddesses that show up, chaos, kind of nothingness; Eros, which is kind of the sexual impulse from which we get a word like erotic from; Tartarus, which is the underworld; and Gaia, which is the ancient Greek word for the earth. How do we get from those kind of abstractions, personifications, natural beings, to that anthropomorphism, those human-shaped deities on Olympus? What has to happen to get us from point A to point B? All right. If you look at this, don't be overwhelmed by this chart here. I know it's a mess of names, and just know I'm not going to hold you responsible for all of these names. It's one of the things that students who are new to mythology are often kind of dizzied by, is the sheer number of names and characters and terms. And I'm not going to say they're not important, but I do. I'll give us. I'll try to bring this down to a manageable scope. So this is a genealogy chart which kind of shows you all of the characters and things and creatures and gods and goddesses that show up in Hesiod's Theogony. And at the top we get there's chaos, which our slide maker has translated as kind of a yawning gap, kind of a big bowl of nothingness. You have Gaia, the earth; you have Tartarus, the underworld; you have Eros, the libido, so to speak. And then as you go down the generations of deities, you get this last generation, these names that are underlined. These are the kind of the more familiar Olympian deities: Poseidon, god of the sea; Zeus, the sky god, king of the gods, Hera, Zeus's wife. You can see he's also his sister, which by human terms is a little bit creepy, but the gods don't play by human rules. Demeter, the goddess of grain and agriculture. Athena, goddess of wisdom and weaving and war. Ares, the goddess of war and the frenzy of war. Hephaestus, the god of craftsmanship. Apollo, the god of music and poetry and rationality and healing and all kinds of other things. His twin sister Artemis, goddess of the hunt, the goddess of the wild, the goddess of the forest. Hermes, the messenger of the gods, but also a god of in between places, of travel, of magic, of thieves. Dionysus, the god of wildness, wine, and frenzy, and of course, dozens of other deities along the way as well. And just by the sheer volume of this kind of stuff and the short time we have together, we're certainly not going to be able to cover all of it. But just to kind of walk us through, I'm not going to try to cover it all here, but to walk us through kind of the early stages of Hesiod's creation story. And I have certainly simplified things here just for the sake of digestion. The world begins with kind of a very simple structure. You have kind of chaos above, kind of the nothingness above. Gaia, the earth, feminine, is already there, and then below the earth you have Tartarus. So you have kind of, again, heaven, earth, and hell to some degree. Heaven, earth, and the underworld. And then Eros comes along. Sex and sexual reproduction is very important for understanding Greek mythology, and so it's by sexual procreation that the universe is born, and it's through sexual procreation that gods and goddesses are born. And so once Eros enters into the picture, he's the catalyst that gets everything going. And so in stage 2, Gaia and Chaos mate. That's what the equal signs signify here. And together they have a number of children. Again, I'm not listing them all here. And one of their children is Uranos, which is simply the Greek word for the sky or heaven. The sea, the mountains, you start to see, so the physical world starts to take on a more complex shape. You have the fates, these kind of figures that govern destiny and time. So you have the dimension of time coming into play. You have giants, you have various creatures that are kind of slouching towards a human shape, but not quite human. So we can see kind of a progression here. And then Gaia and Uranos, so kind of mother and son, mate together. And again, you have to ignore the kind of the obviously kind of the creepy incestuousness here. Again, with the gods, these things simply don't apply. And again, you go back far enough, the dating pool is pretty shallow, right? Who's there is there. But you have Earth Goddess mating with Uranos, Sky God, and this was a pairing that the Greeks themselves had a term for, a hieros gamos, which means a holy marriage. And so Earth Goddess and Sky God is kind of the core pairing in any kind of polytheistic universe. You see, this is not just a Greek thing. So Gaia and Uranos have a number of children here. You also have the first appearance of Aphrodite, as you'll see in the Powell text. Aphrodite, who is the goddess of love, the goddess of sex, the goddess of lust. She has a very complicated genealogy. She actually shows up twice, and so in some versions she's a daughter of Zeus. But in Hesiod's version, she actually comes on the scene before Zeus. It's also in these generations we have the first Theomachy. We have a rebellion against son Kronos against the father. One of the classic rivalries that is throughout kind of Greek tragic tales. And so Kronos actually takes a sickle and he castrates his father, cuts off his genitals. Greek mythology is not for the faint of heart. This is not the stuff you're going to find in Disney cartoons. It's pretty earthy. So get ready. And tosses Uranos' severed genitals into the sea, where foam gathers around them, as you do. And out of that foam is born Aphrodite. So we have kind of a female Eros, a female goddess of sex. You may have heard of Aphrodite before, and conventionally, heard her defined as the goddess of love, but she really is a goddess of kind of lust, of sex. Is a much more accurate way of understanding her. Stage 4, Rhea and Kronos, again, brother and sister, get together, and there we start to see some of the familiar names from Greek mythology: Zeus, Hera, Hestia, an Olympian deity and a goddess of the home fires of the household. Demeter, Hades, and Poseidon. Hades, god of the underworld and the dead, and Poseidon, god of the sea and the raging wild sea. These are all characters we will encounter in detail later on. All right, so we have so Theomachy, kind of this warring between generations, defines a lot of what's going on here. So we had Kronos, son rebelling against his father, and once Uranus is castrated, he's out of the game, as you might expect someone suffering that to be. But then Zeus, the kind of the firstborn, you might say, of the next generation, rebels against Kronos, or you say it's actually Kronos decides that these children that he has are a threat to him, so he starts to swallow them, but eventually it disgorges them, and his generation of gods, usually referred to as the Titans, goes to war with Zeus and his brothers and sisters, known as the Olympians, and it's ultimately the Olympian generation that defeats the Titans, and that sets the stage for the pantheon that governs the vast majority of Greek mythology. And so throughout we have this move from the abstract, Uranos, kind of he's a god, but he's also the sky, but at the end we're to Zeus. So Zeus is still a sky god. That's one of his primary associations, but he's no longer the sky, if you see what I mean. So we've separated from that abstraction to the anthropomorphic, and so Zeus and his brothers and sisters and his children and his, you might call his nieces and nephews, are much more anthropoid. They're much more humanoid than previous generations. And so yes, as I said, the sex and the power of sex is very important in Greek mythology. And I think one of the things that Hesiod illustrates in this story is kind of the two-edged power of procreation. Zeus, again, if you know something about Zeus, one of the things he's most famous for is that he doesn't have a lot of control over his own libido. He's married to Hera, but he sleeps with anything that moves, and he's constantly cheating on his wife. And so it seems that Zeus has a big Aphrodite Eros problem, and he does. But in this story, at least at the beginning, he understands the power of procreation in a way that Kronos doesn't. So Kronos sees his children and says, "Oh, my children are a threat. They're going to overthrow me. I better eat them." And Zeus understands, at least at this stage in the game, that having your children as allies, like Zeus's favorite daughter Athena, as someone who can support your rule and shape your universe rather than threaten it, is the way to go. Now, the Works and Days, like I said, it's framed as a farmer's almanac, filled with moral maxims and lots of advice of when to plow and when to plant and when to harvest and such. And it has kind of an interesting frame that we don't fully understand. It seems to be Hesiod is writing this for his lazy brother, Perseus. That's not Perseus, the famous hero who beheads Medusa. This is a character only shows up once in all of Greek tales. But apparently Perseus is a lazy brother and doesn't want to do what he has to do to keep the farm going. And Hesiod says, "Work is all there is, Perseus." And in fact, Hesiod's in the Works and Days in particular, it's a very pessimistic view of the universe, a very pessimistic view of humanity. And I would say that kind of pessimism runs through most of Greek mythology. But I would say it doesn't get any worse than Hesiod. Hesiod has a very dark view of the place of humanity. And so he basically says to his brother Perseus, "Listen, life sucks, and it's not going to get any better, and all you can do is work. That's all there is. So get off your butt and do what you need to do." And then he uses that frame to kind of tell a story or stories to his brothers to explain why things are so bad. So he's got this very cynical, very pessimistic view of the universe and of the potential of human progress. So watch for this. Like I said, I don't think it gets a lot worse than Hesiod throughout Greek mythology, but that strain of kind of pessimism about humanity is present in lots of the stuff that we'll read. Now, one of the famous stories that he tells in the Works and Days is this myth of the five ages, and this is a very kind of common archetype. You find this in other mythologies around the world too. Is that this idea that if you go way back when to the beginnings of things, time of humanity, that's when there was a time of perfection or near perfection, and then over time or something happens and it all goes to hell. And now we live in this kind of evil, darkened world that is very difficult to deal with. So if you think about, if you're familiar with kind of the Judeo-Christian mythos of the Garden of Eden, where there's Adam and Eve are brought into a kind of a perfected kind of nature that's in harmony with God. There's very little distance between God and humanity, but then they eat the fruit. They disobey the deity and they're kicked out, and we have this fall. This is a similar kind of story. So Hesiod says that way back when there was a golden age where humanity lived in harmony with nature and in harmony with the gods. But over time, they turn away from the gods and they start to fight amongst themselves, and the gods turn their backs on humanity, and humans degenerate. They distrust each other and they start to fight. And so the golden age devolves into the silver age, which devolves into the bronze age. Now, what's interesting in the Greeks, in the Greek, I should say Hesiod's version, there is kind of this uptick in the graph, where there's a heroic age that, for a brief moment in time, that downturn is stemmed, and there was a generation where men were men again, and there were great heroes, and there was a great sense of promise in the land. Most people associate this with kind of the great age of the Homeric heroes like Odysseus and Achilles and Ajax and Hector, figures that we'll meet very, very soon. But once the earth covers that generation of heroes, then the graph plunges even lower into the Iron Age, and this is the era that Hesiod says this is where he and his brother Perseus live, thoroughly corrupted, thoroughly awful, very little hope, very little light at the end of any sort of tunnel. And so again, it's unlike a story like the Garden of Eden, where there's this moment, it's the disobedience against the gods' edict. You can eat any fruit in the garden except for that one, and when they do it, that's the fall. In Hesiod's tale, there's no kind of flashpoint. There's no moment where this happens once and for all. It's kind of like this idea that humanity contains within itself kind of the seeds of degeneration, and the natural decline, or the decline of humanity is a natural one. There's a kind of internal evil, what the Greeks might call a hubris, a kind of arrogance, an overweening pride that gets the better of humanity, and they lose whatever heroism or kind of natural divinity that was there with them at the beginning, and their laziness ultimately overcomes their work ethic, so to speak. Now, the other famous, perhaps more famous myth in this story is the myth of Pandora, and here too, it's hard to know what Hesiod is up to. So he never kind of tells in his myths, this is why I'm telling you this story, and this is the lesson to be learned. No, he just kind of lays it out there. So one of the theories is, and take it or leave it, but one of the theories is that the myth of the five ages explains kind of that humanity is broken on the inside. There's internal evils, and the myth of Pandora explains where all the external evils, what the Greeks called kaka. Okay, you don't have to know ancient Greek to know that kaka is a bad thing. Kaka just means wicked stuff, bad stuff. And this explains the kind of the evils that humanity has to deal with on the outside: famine, natural disasters, plague, disease, that kind of thing. And so Pandora is sometimes she's described as the Greek Eve. She's the first woman, human woman, that is actually Zeus creates her as a punishment to mankind. And so Zeus starts to make the mistake, or he starts to get paranoid like Kronos did, and he sees humanity not as part of his realm but as a threat. And so he has Pandora, this beautiful, bewitching woman, created by the gods and goddesses. He enlists all the other kind of gods and goddesses to do their part to build this first woman. So Pandora's name means something. Pan meaning all, Dora meaning gift. So all of the gods and goddesses give their gifts to build this Greek Eve, and then he passes it along to humanity through the unwitting help of a titan by the name of Epimetheus. And so this idea is that humanity, as long as it was all male, their potential was unlimited for power and for building and for craft. We'll see. You'll see there is there's of course any time you kind of go back in history to various cultures, the vast majority of them, by modern values, strike us as very misogynistic, and the Greeks are no different. We'll talk more about this kind of the role of women and the depiction of women, and what do we do with that today, and how do we interpret that. Again, I don't think it gets worse than in Hesiod if you're attuned and sensitive to these kinds of things. But yeah, here we have women is created as a punishment for mankind, and Zeus's idea is that if I send a woman to man, they will be endlessly distracted, and they will forget about anything having to overthrow me. So there is kind of this very again, to the modern eye and ear, it sounds awful. Yes, male is kind of associated with the good, original, the happy, and the natural, and then the feminine is created as a corrupted copy of that. So we'll come back to that. I know that for a lot of people this is a big turnoff, but I do want to help us to understand this contextually, and not to kind of paint the ancient Greeks with a broad brush and say, well, this is let's just reject it out of hand because this is awful, hateful stuff. I think it's more nuanced than that, and I think it's also very important to kind of understand these cultures on their own terms and as best we can in their own historical context, and we'll kind of explore what this means. Of course, now Pandora is most famous for what she releases. Now, in the kind of the story that most people know of, have heard, it's Pandora and her box, and she opens this box, and out of the box fly all these caca, and all of these things that descend on humanity: plague, famine, disease, and the like, which just makes human life much, much worse. But you'll notice, you'll read this in the Polytext, that in Hesiod's version, she doesn't open a box; it's a jar, and Hesiod doesn't give her any motivation. Again, it's a really weird narrative. Suddenly there's a jar there, and she removes the lid. She's not tempted. It's not kind of out of curiosity, as in some ways how the story is sometimes kind of fleshed out in later versions. But in this earliest version, a jar is simply there, and she opens the lid, and things fly out. And humanity is all the worse because of this. And so an interesting question, I mean, it's not a be-all, end-all, but why a jar and not a box? We're so used to hear about Pandora's box. Well, one of the theories is that the jar, actually the word that Hesiod used there for the jar in the Greek, refers to kind of a tall, two-handled jar that was often used as kind of a metaphorical symbol for a woman. And I should have a picture here. I don't have it here, but the jar is kind of shaped in kind of the cliched hourglass shape of a woman. And so it's thought that maybe that Hesiod thinks is that the jar is not just a jar, that it represents womankind. And so if you know the story, when you read the story, you'll see that Pandora she slams the lid back on the jar, and the only thing that is left inside is hope. Hope is trapped in the jar. All the bad stuff went out. And so I think Hesiod leaves this as kind of a teasing image. You could read that very pessimistically and say, oh, great, the one good thing in the jar doesn't get out, hope. But another way to read this is that if the jar represents femininity, if it represents womanhood, as some have taken, the jar represents kind of the womb of every woman, the idea is that every woman with her capacity to give birth to a new generation, is this idea that every generation then could be hope reborn into the world. And so maybe we could see in this kind of a small glimmer of hope itself, a glimmer of a light at the end of the tunnel that is a counter kind of that deep cynicism and pessimism that Hesiod offers to us in the vast majority of his stories. All right, plenty for this topic. This will all be fleshed out, of course, by the course text, and I will talk to you next time.